Hello and welcome again to Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, part 3 of 3, beginning with verse 31. In our outline of the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see that we have already talked about all but one of the topics covered in chapter 5. Before moving into chapter 6 in our next lesson, we want to finish our discussion of the new authority which we began in chapter 5 and verse 21. Let's read verses 31 and verses 32 of Matthew chapter 5. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of a divorce. But I say unto you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Let's say a few words about marriage among the Jews in the first century, marriage among the Greeks, and marriage among the Romans. The Jew was expected to either get married or devote his life to the law. God had told them he hated divorce in Malachi 2 and verse 16. Eventually, the Jews came to allow a man to divorce a woman for any reason, and a woman to divorce a man for absolutely no reason. See Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1. By Jesus' time, a man could divorce a woman with a simple written statement and two witnesses. Meanwhile, the Greeks had a different idea about marriage. As Christianity would begin to spread, disciples would find themselves in many different cultures, many of them in the Mediterranean, influenced by the Greeks. Let me read something to you from Barclay, if I can find it quickly. I apologize for that. The Greek Demosthenes laid it down as an accepted practice of life. Here's what Demosthenes said. We have courtesans for the sake of pleasure. We have concubines for the sake of daily cohabitation. And we have wives for the purpose of having children legitimately and of having a faithful guardian for all of our household affairs. This was not an unknown opinion of Greeks concerning how marriage was to work. Relationships for men outside of marriage was considered the ordinary and conventional thing, and the Greeks had no legal process for divorce. A man would merely dismiss his wife in the presence of two witnesses with the stipulation that he would return her dowry. Meanwhile, marriage among the Romans. In the first 500 years of the Roman Empire, homes and marriages were strong. In the records, there can be found no divorce during these years. Then Rome conquered Greece, or did it? The Greek immorality overran Rome. Divorce and remarriage became commonplace. It was convenient to be married in the Roman Empire because a tax was placed on you if you were unmarried. When we get to Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, we will discuss the ideal Christian marriage further. But for now, suffice it to say, the chaste teachings of Jesus concerning marriage in the first century were falling on ears pretty much equal to the type of ears that we have to preach to and teach to in this world today. Jesus' idea of chastity was an ideal that the general population never even dreamed of. If a man divorces his wife without cause, he is an accomplice to her adultery if she remarries. Fornication is the only exception to the rule that would give a person the right to remarry without sin, and marrying a wrongly divorced person is adultery. Let's read some more verses. Again, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. To the Jews, oaths were serious business. They were taught to always tell the truth, but especially when what they were saying was accompanied by an oath. In Jesus' time, though, there was a problem with frivolous swearing, usually when someone was trying to emphasize a point. Also, the more creative among the Jews had made an art of evasive swearing. The absolutely binding oaths contained God's name, and other oaths that evaded using God's name were not binding. We'll talk much more about this when we get to chapter 23, verses 16 through 22, but if you can't wait, then perhaps you should pause the video and go read those verses right now. Jesus makes it clear, no matter how you take an oath, God is your partner in it, and therefore it is binding. Can we truly divide our lives into the secular and spiritual? Are all promises to be regarded as sacred? Well, I think they will be when we realize all promises are made in God's presence. Is Jesus calling for an end to all oaths? Well, a man's word is his bond. The Essenes taught that a man who cannot be believed without swearing is condemned already. And the modern-day Quakers refuse to take any kind of oath. We do know that Paul and Jesus put themselves under oath in the New Testament. See 2 Corinthians 1:23, Galatians 1:20, and Matthew 26:63. He says anything more than your yes and your no comes from evil, and that could mean two things. That could mean, because human nature tends toward evil, it is sometimes necessary for us to take an oath, such as in our country when we go to court. In a perfect world, oaths would not be needed, but since it is not a perfect world, an occasion might arise where oaths could be required. Meanwhile, it is our obligation to live in such transparent way that men do not expect an oath from us. Let's read along. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you, take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. The law of tit for tat is found in even more ancient documents than even the law of Moses, but you might go back into the law of Moses, consider what was said in Exodus 21:23 through 25, Leviticus 24:19 through 20, and Deuteronomy 19:18 through 21. Is this a bloodthirsty law, as some claim? This eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? I'd have to say that this law is actually the beginning of mercy, since the aim of this law was to limit vengeance. This law was actually enacted to prevent blood feuds. Someone takes your eye, so you kill them? Nope. Someone takes your eye, their eye will be taken, and not necessarily by you. It was a law that gave the private individual the right to exact vengeance, but, and this is huge, it needed to be administered by a judge. So this is not open warfare. This is a restriction that if something is done to you, the same thing will be done to them, but it will not be done by you. It will be administered by a judge. One thing you need to understand is among the Jews that this law was rarely administered literally. Let me share some words from Barclay. If a man has injured another, he is liable on 5 counts: for injury, for pain, for healing, for loss of time, for indignity suffered. In regard to injury, the injured man is looked on as a slave to be sold in the marketplace. His value before and after the injury was assessed, and the man was responsible for the injury had to pay the difference. He was responsible for the loss in value of the man injured. In regard to pain, it was estimated how much money a man would accept to be willing to undergo the pain of the injury inflicted, and the man responsible for the injury had to pay that sum. In regard to healing, the injurer had to pay all the expenses of the necessary medical attention until a complete cure had been effected. In regard to loss of time, the injurer had to pay compensation for the wages lost while the injured man was unable to work, and he also had to pay compensation if the injured man had held a well-paid position and was now, in consequence of the injury, fit for less well-rewarded work. In regard to indignity, the injurer had to pay damages for the humiliation and indignity which the injury had inflicted. In actual practice, the type of compensation which was laid down by their law is strangely modern. But we have to understand that this law of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, is not the entire law of Moses. When we go and look at passages such as Leviticus 19 and 18, Proverbs 24:29, and Lamentations 3:30, we see that there is mercy in the law of Moses as well as vengeance. Meanwhile, Jesus sets the law of eye for an eye aside. He says it has no place in his followers' lives. So it's the end of resentment and retaliation. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Even when receiving a direct and calculated insult, the Christian cannot retaliate or even resent it. Jesus is asking some hard things of his followers. They're going to take our tunic and we're going to offer our cloak. You know, the law forbade permanently taking someone's cloak as a pledge. Exodus 22, 26, and 27. Why? The Christian does not use their legal rights as leverage. What is the first thing repeat offenders call for? Their rights. Meanwhile, the Christian puts his duties before his rights and his responsibilities before his privileges. Jesus calls on us to go the extra mile. This impressment was common in occupied countries such as Palestine. You'll remember Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross of Jesus. So as Christians, we must do our duties as service gladly rendered. What do the inefficient worker, the resentful servant, and the ungracious helper have in common? None of these are living the Christian life. Meanwhile, the Christian is ready to help, even if the request is unreasonable. Let's talk about gracious giving. Take a moment and pause the video and read again verses 38 through 42, as well as Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11. In their teachings, the rabbis laid down 5 principles of giving. 1, giving must not be refused. Then giving must befit the man to whom the gift is given. Giving should be carried out privately and secretly. Gifts given for the sake of prestige or publicity were not acceptable. The manner of the giving must befit the character of the receiver. The giving was as much of a help as the gift itself. Let me restate that. The act of giving was to be as much of a help as the gift itself. And giving is a privilege and an obligation because all giving is considered giving to God. Is Jesus calling for indiscriminate giving? One rabbi put it this way: it is better to help 20 fake beggars than to turn away one man that is truly in need. So this idea that Jesus lays down here in these verses is a great segue into verses 43 through 48. So let's take a moment and read those out. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have from that? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. What is the meaning of Christian love? Well, the Greeks have 4 words for love that we're going to look at. Some of these are New Testament words, and I'll tell you now, one of these is not a New Testament word. But these are words that can mean love in the Greek language. First, S-T-O-R-G-E, storge, which is family affection. And the one that never occurs in the New Testament is eros, which is translated the terrible longing. Then philia, which is honest love and affection. It's a warm and tender love. And then agape, which is invincible goodwill. So when we're called upon to love our enemies, which one of these loves are we called upon to love them with? Well, it's not family affection. An erotic love, that's not even mentioned in the Bible anywhere in the New Testament. And then philia, a warm and tender, honest love and affection. Or is it indeed agape, invincible goodwill? Well, where does agape love lead us? Number 1, that's how we have to love our enemies, with agape love, not philia or storge. Family and brotherly love are emotionally charged, not so with agape, which most people translate the word agape to mean looking out for someone's best interest. The love shows itself in us only if we let Jesus lead us to it. It calls for us to love the unlovable, and therefore it is a determination of our wills. It's not a determination of our hearts. It does not allow us to let someone run amok because that's what they want to do. If we honestly love someone with invincible goodwill, we will correct them and even punish them if necessary. Punishment dealt from love is always remedial. It's not retribution. This is a command aimed at me. It's about personal relationships more than international relationships. It's about how man gets along with man. It's not about how countries get along with countries or political parties get along with political parties. It's about you and me getting along with each other. Only with the help of Christ can we expect to live this kind of love. I want to share something from Jim McGuiggan. And this is quoted by Chumbley in his commentary. Jim McGuiggan says, his, that is Jesus' love, is, or God or Jesus' love, is no if love. I'll love you if you do what I say. Nope, that's not it. His is more than because love. I love you because. His is an anyway love. I love you no matter how you are. So when we think of the kind of love we must have for our enemies, we are talking about this anyway kind of love. Jesus expects us to pray for our enemies. And Barclay says the surest way to cure bitterness towards a person is to pray for the one that we're tempted to hate. Let's talk about the reason for Christian love. It's made up of a few components. I think I have 6 components written down here. First of all, it makes us more like God. Jesus says the rain falls on the just and the unjust in Psalms 145 and 15. And Jesus quotes that here. And what that tells us is how the world operates is not going to be determined by whether we're good or we're bad. That's not going to change the world. We're going to be good or bad depending on what we will to do. And he wants us to reach for perfection. The word implies maturity and functionality, and a person is perfect when he begins to do things God designed him to do. See Genesis 1:26. God seeks our highest good and expects us to seek the highest good of our fellow man. To quote Chumbley again, to be a perfect, mature disciple, we must render good for evil, speak the truth, honor our marital commitments, resist adulterous thoughts, live at peace with all, and act in the best interests of all, including our enemies. In other words, we must learn to love as God loves, so then we can begin to forgive as God forgives. Thanks for watching. If you'd take a moment and subscribe to this channel, I would greatly appreciate it. Give us a like or a dislike. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you think. And next time we'll begin our study of Matthew chapter 6 as the Sermon on the Mount continues. Until then, may God bless you.